Hello, I'm Bruno Putzeys. I'm the lead designer of loudspeakers at Key, among other things. I think still most people know me best for designing amplifiers. I started doing that at the start of my career at Philips, and I always had this fascination for this new technology called Class D amplification, which at the time wasn't taken very seriously as a technology for hi-fi, or let alone high-end. I wrung people's arms to let me research Class D, and I did so, and came up with an initial circuit called UCD, and I took that circuit to my next employer, which was Hypex, and I think this is probably what most people will still know me for. Designing first these UCD modules and then Encore modules at Hypex, and I actually still do amplifier design for another company called Purify. So that was essentially what I was known for before starting Key. Although I did already dabble in other things like D to A converters and so on. So there's a D to A converter from Mola. Mola still on the market, which I designed in 2013, and which is still pretty good by the standards of today. At some point in my amplifier career, of course, you start getting in touch with customers who want to do active loudspeakers, and that became very interesting and fascinating for me. And I quickly realized that doing better and better amplifiers is only going to move sound quality along so much. And it is through those first contacts with customers who were then other companies building active loudspeakers that I really picked up some experience, and I quickly realized that I had thoughts and insights concerning acoustics and loudspeaker design, and especially DSP control of those loudspeakers that were already beyond my then customers. So I realized that if I wanted to move on with active speaker design, I would have to start my own venture and design a speaker exactly in the way that I believed it had to be. It had to be done. What we mainly want to achieve is loudspeakers that have a predictable and robust performance in a large diversity of spaces. And in the case of virtually any other loudspeaker, the main problem is that loudspeakers radiate sound in all directions, at least at low frequencies. So you think the speaker may be pointing at you, but down from a couple of hundred hertz, the sound is just as loud behind the speaker as it is in front of the speaker, and that means that the room acoustics will have an outsized influence on the final result. Again, particularly in the low mids and the bass. So fundamentally, what we try to do with all Key loudspeakers is to try and control directivity of the loudspeaker down to as low a frequency as is realistic, and then at frequencies below that actually rely on the presence of a wall, which then becomes a help rather than a hindrance in achieving an even bass response in a room. In the case of the Key 7, for instance, which is our newest model, which is also our smallest model, the cardioid is simply formed using the mid-range and the side woofers, and so the mid-range is actually taken fairly low. It operates down to 120 hertz or something. And at such a low frequency, the sound bends around the cabinet completely. So, and then it ends up reflecting off the rear wall, which you don't want, not at such a high frequency. In that same band, the side woofers are actually used to absorb the sound that tries to make its way around the cabinet. But, I mean, it's a simple way of putting it. We target a cardioid response, meaning that the output that is aimed directly rearward is minimized. And this is the Key 3 with its extension unit BXT. This is our first product, and you see the same thing here as with the Key 7. So you've got a mid-range and you've got the side woofers. In the Key 3, the same cardioid beamforming is done as in the Key 7, which is to say the mid-range emits sound. Some of it will bend around the cabinet and get absorbed by the side woofers. However, what the Key 3 then has extra is a pair of woofers on the back, meaning that as we go down the frequency scale below 250 Hertz, I can cut out the mid-range and use only the woofers to form a cardioid. The sound emanating from there and the woofers in the rear are working essentially in opposite polarity with a small delay added, so that by the time the sound gets there, it gets cancelled by what's radiated by the woofers in the back. Below 50 Hertz, all woofers operate in tandem, completely in phase. Meaning at that point, below 50 Hertz, the speaker will become omnidirectional, like an ordinary speaker. But as I said, an ordinary speaker would actually become omnidirectional from a few hundred Hertz down. And at 50 Hertz, the wavelength is so long that whatever bounces off the wall is still in phase as it comes back. That gives you a 6 decibel reinforcement. And all you need to do to control that is to take down the bass by those same 6 decibels. And as a result, the Key 3 and the Key 7, they are intended to go close to the wall, although you can use them freestanding if you want, and then you don't do that 6 decibel cut. But they are intended to go against the wall, and at that point, essentially the radiated power of the speaker is half of the radiated power that you would see in well, actually it's more than half. It's a quarter. 6 decibels is a quarter in terms of power compared to a traditional loudspeaker, which means that you have 6 decibels less ambient reflections. 6 decibels doesn't sound like a lot, but in actual fact, what it means is that if with a traditional loudspeaker, you might have some very vicious peaks and very vicious dips in the in-room response, you actually get something which is reasonably flat without any further action needing to be taken. This is kind of revolutionary because it means that an ordinary living room will now sound more like a studio space, and with very tight, controlled, punchy bass, and of course, if you then use those speakers in a studio space, it simply sounds unbelievable. That's the main principle, and then there are other things which we also think are important, which is that the whole crossover filter is phase corrected so that all frequencies arrive at the same time. People might be used to listening to passive speakers and thereby used to ignoring the phase shift that is introduced by a crossover filter. But actually, once you've gotten used to a phase corrected system, and especially with music which is very timing sensitive, like free jazz or Indian classical music or anything like that, you will find that you will have a much greater appreciation for what these musicians are doing timing and rhythm wise if you listen on a phase corrected system compared to even a passive two-way. Well, provided that you can use those speakers to actually reproduce a studio-like environment in your home, which as I explained, we try to achieve by controlling directivity and reducing room influence. It allows you to actually hear what the mix engineer has heard, because it seems to me that musicians, artists, and the technical people, engineers, producers, and so on, they put an enormous amount of effort into getting precisely a particular sound. If they get a particular sound in the studio, that is because they wanted to have that sound. If you were to go into that studio and listen to that recording in that same studio, you would really get a musical experience which far surpasses what you have when you listen to it in a completely different environment with completely different loudspeakers. By designing a loudspeaker which is actually usable in a studio and in a home, just purely technical exercise, making sure that the speaker functions well in these two surroundings, practically guarantees that you will get a much closer link to what the artists are trying. So the word they're using for that in studios is translation. And very often in studios what you find is that they use a variety of loudspeakers and a variety of listening environments, not just their studio, by the way, in order to second guess what the listener in their home might hear. And well, that to me is a mug's game, because I mean, if you have to listen to your mix in the studio and in your home and in your car before you know that it's that it's a good mix, then there is something wrong with the monitoring environment. And it turns out that that studio people actually agree with it, because everyone who's been using key loudspeakers in their studio, they came back saying, "Oh, I can skip all the other listening environments. If it sounds good in the studio on the key threes, I know it'll be the best possible result for most users, most listeners, most listening spaces." And that's even without actually requiring that the listener uses the key three as well. So there was already something that needed to be fixed in the studio environment, loudspeaker wise. So both the key 3 and the key 7 turn out to give recording engineers a much clearer insight in what it is they're doing. If they're making small changes to EQ or to dynamics or whatnot, they actually hear it immediately. They say, "Well, it's so much quicker to get a good mix done, and I can rely on it." And then they say, "Well, the key speakers really translate." And then if you take the key speakers into the home, you just get twice that advantage, I would say, is because on the one hand, in the studio, they've proven to be much more revealing and much more neutral than other studio monitors. And then take it home, you get a much better insight in what is in the recording. So my impression about, let's say, the previous practice when people would have studio speakers and home speakers is that probably both the hi-fi speaker and the studio speaker were flawed in some way, in different ways, and they were both trying to second guess each other what the home speaker should be, what the studio speaker should be. But if you can standardize on one type of sound, especially if you can prove that it's a neutral sound, which because you could standardize on any sound if you like, but if it's a neutral sound, you can easily then people can easily target the same sound in the home and in the studio. And of course, there are still people who initially are shocked by the fact that suddenly there's so much information coming at them, and the sound is so dynamic and precise, and most hi-fi speakers sort of cover their flaws by toning down the top end and what they call voicing. We don't voice, by the way. We don't do any of that. So for the first few days, people actually use when they buy key speakers, they might use the tone controls to sort of take it down a bit, and then after a while they set it flat again, because they say, well, hang on, I now know what the sound is. This is about. So it's not purely a matter of philosophy on my point. We just see it in practice, both in studios and in homes, that as soon as people get what the value is of a proper neutral sound, they'll just go for it. I think that there's a variety of reasons for that. The first reason I would say is that whenever there is a significant technological advance, people have to turn that technological advance into an end product. They still have to find their feet. So it means that when transistors first became available and capable of high enough power, valve amplifiers were at that point well established and highly optimized in terms of performance. And then transistors came along, and it took a while before people actually figured out what to do with transistors to make a good sounding amplifier with us. So early transistor amplifiers just sounded pretty horrible. And the same thing repeated with the introduction of digital audio, first CD players off and first digital recorders and so on, were not much to listen to. People realized that they were the future, so out of enthusiasm, people jumped on it. But if you listen to them, you would go like, well, give me my old analog back, thank you very much. And of course, shortly after that, the new technology does come into its own, and it does immediately starts to run rings around that around the old technology. But that initial transition, every time that happens, there will be certain people who will be so disappointed by the hype around the new technology that they say, well, this isn't going to go anywhere. This is where I gotta get off. So you see that with valves to transistors. Within valves, actually, there are some people who say, well, you shouldn't be using pentodes because triodes sound much better. And within triodes, there are people who say, well, you shouldn't be using indirect heated cathodes. So all of these technological transitions always resulted in a number of people preferring a highly evolved example of the old technology versus a completely new, unevolved example of the new technology, and therefore sort of completely missing the fact that by now that all those teething troubles are over. With vinyl, there is also a cultural aspect to it, which is that since digital audio is the de facto format for this for listening to music under all circumstances, masters intended to be released as digital. They're usually more highly compressed, so that they also work in the car and whatnot, and so on. Whereas vinyl is explicitly a home listening format. So a master made for vinyl release will actually have more breathing space than a master for digital release, even though both masters are digital nowadays. And a digital format ought to allow a much greater dynamic range. Very often, it's not used when the intended release is a digital stream. Whereas in the case of analog, they allow themselves much more space for the music to breathe. So the fact that the two formats have different use cases and are part of a different way of experiencing music means that the sound which is put on them is very often different. And then finally, I would say that for me personally, the charm of vinyl is you put on a record and you sit back, and at that point you can't skip tracks or anything. So you are there for at least half of the album, that you can't do anything else, and you get drawn into the music in a different way. Not because not because of the sound necessarily, because there are quite a number of digital masters on streaming which are lots better than their vinyl counterparts, but simply the fact that you don't get tempted to look at your phone and skip tracks and whatnot. So what I'll do is if I've heard music on the radio which I like and I want to know more of, I start the album from the start and I put my phone away. And I just sit there until it's done. That aspect of the vinyl experience that is fully reproduced in that way. And as I said, if you're lucky and the digital master is good, then it'll sound better than vinyl too. I should say necessarily, if only for purely practical reasons. Modern consumers are used to products that are extremely unfussy in their use. That is to say, you plug them in and you flip open an app on your phone and you play music. That sort of ease of use is expected. If only for that reason, I would say that you actually need to integrate the whole system into one box if the hi-fi industry is to survive. Because people are just not interested in going back into time. I mean, put yourself in their shoes. So you are used to, say, a Sonos system, or even worse, one of those little Bluetooth speakers, and suddenly you realise that you actually would like to have better sound in your home, and then you unsuspectingly walk into a local hi-fi show, and what do you see there? You see a room stacked full of separate boxes, wired together with cables. It's a pair of big speakers with what I call a steampunk altar in the middle. You just walk out again, and you say, "Well, sorry, if this is what it takes to get good music in my house, I give up." So purely from the perspective of getting better sound into more people's homes, you will have to think about products which are much more rational, which fit in there in the lifestyle that they're otherwise used to. And then secondly, there is simply the fact that that passive loudspeakers, they have these fundamental shortcomings, especially to do with their complete inability to produce a coherent transient response, because the high frequencies come first out of the tweet, followed by the mid-range, followed by the woofer, and that is something that in a passive speaker you cannot do anything about. It is considered to be a fact of life. But the problem with that fact of life is that the sort of more powerful a speaker gets, the more hopeless its transient response becomes, and sort of the less truthful and direct that the music will sound. So those are fundamental shortcomings of classic hi-fi stacks with separate amplifiers and separate loudspeakers. That's where DSP comes in. You can both get a much more even frequency response. You can control dispersion, as we've discussed earlier, and you can control the phase response to perfection, meaning that essentially you can get the same impulse response as an electrostat out of a compact dynamic loudspeaker. Also, you can if you build everything into one box, it is much easier to optimize the design to have both a grown-up, competent, low-frequency performance combined with a small box. You can't do that with a passive speaker. A passive speaker has to have a naturally flat bass response, or because otherwise there's nothing you can do about it. And that means that those loudspeakers necessarily have to be rather large. So I would say, both from a practical perspective, from in terms of usability, from pure performance perspective, is that just the DSP speakers can do things that passive speakers will never be able to do, and from again a more practical perspective, is that you can get that performance in a more practical form factor. And with an acoustic behavior that actually makes it work in a realistic room. I think it's fairly obvious that passive speakers are on the way out in very much the same way as let's say valve amplifiers and so on are a shrinking subculture. Passive speakers will be a shrinking subculture in the future too, with the majority of the market happily enjoying amazing music on amazing active speakers. A continuation of what you've seen already, which is to say that Key is not a company that quickly releases one model after another. So first there was the Key 3, and then the BXT, so the bass extension that sits underneath, was released only like 4 years after, which of course did turn the system into a new product in that way. But yeah, 4 years between two products. The Key 7 again took some time. I'm not necessarily saying that we're going to keep the pace that low, but we will keep concentrating on figuring out exactly what product we can do that causes say the biggest upset in the market in which it will be pitched, either a smaller or a bigger product. what we want to do is we want to make to make a product that is so unique in its own space that people are never wondering, like, should I buy this key speaker or should I buy that key speaker, because any next product will in its own right be so distinct in terms of use case, in terms of target market, that it'll stand alone.